just when you thought there were no more Trump-endorsed candidates left to lose an election today, another one did. 3 times. It is a once-in-a-century event for the leading candidate for Speaker of the House from the majority party to lose a vote for the speakership. The last time it happened, as you've heard by now, is exactly 100 years ago in 1923. And the one time that it happened before that was in 1855. And in 1855, it took a full 2 months for the House of Representatives to elect a speaker. That is the record. 2 months to elect a speaker. And as of now, we know it will take at least 2 days after the House adjourned today at the end of the 3rd vote for speaker. Today, the Republican Party in the House of Representatives gave the country a full demonstration of what Republican governance looks like and will look like. A Republican leader who cannot lead and cannot win the votes of his own party because he's being blocked by 20 Republicans. 20 Republicans. 10% of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. They are blocking anything happening in the House of Representatives because they are insisting on voting for another Republican who cannot win the speakership. Republican gridlock created by Republicans voting against Republicans in the House of Representatives. Kevin McCarthy proved today that he is the weakest candidate for Speaker of the House by a majority party in 100 years. And by the 3rd vote today, he got even weaker when the Republican opposition grew from 19 to 20.
Total number of votes cast is 434, of which the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries of the state of New York has received 212. The Honorable Kevin McCarthy of the state of California has received 203. The Honorable Andy Biggs of the state of Arizona has received 10. The Honorable Jim Jordan of the state of Ohio has received 6. Total number of votes cast is 434, of which the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries of the state of New York has received 212. The Honorable Kevin McCarthy of the state of California has received 203. The Honorable Jim Jordan of the state of Ohio has received 19. Total number of votes cast is 434, of which the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries of the state of New York has received 212. The Honorable Kevin McCarthy of the state of California has received 202. The Honorable Jim Jordan of the state of Ohio has received 20. No person having received the majority of the whole number of votes cast by surname, a speaker has not been elected.
There's a lot of history in that video. The candidate with the most votes every time is the first black candidate for speaker with the full support of his party, Hakeem Jeffries. And announcing that vote today is the person who is now in charge of the House of Representatives, the first black woman to be in charge of the House of Representatives, Cheryl Johnson, the clerk of the House of Representatives. Clerk is a very important position in the House. And as I told you last night, until a speaker is elected, Cheryl Johnson is the boss of the House, as she demonstrated today.
The House be in order. Will the House be in order?
And she got the House in order more effectively than any Republican could until there is a Speaker of the House. Clerk Cheryl Johnson now has the power to, quote, preserve order and decorum and decide all questions of order. That means anything not decided by a vote of the House will be decided by Cheryl Johnson until a speaker is elected. If this goes the way it did in 1855, Cheryl Johnson could be in charge of the House for 2 months or longer, because the huge problem for Kevin McCarthy tonight is that there is no deadline on electing a Speaker of the House. No deadline. And deadlines are the most powerful tools that Congress has to force members to coalesce into a majority vote. So Cheryl Johnson will gavel the House into session tomorrow at 12 noon, and we might see exactly the same thing happen again tomorrow and the day after and the day after. As usual, Donald Trump is now distancing himself from his latest endorsed loser. In a brief phone conversation with NBC News' Garrett Haake, Donald Trump refused to say tonight if he still endorses Kevin McCarthy for Speaker. He said, "We'll see what happens." When he was asked directly if he was still supporting Kevin McCarthy, "We'll see what happens." He said, "I got everybody calling me, wanting my support, but let's see what happens. And we'll go, I got everybody calling, wanting my support. That's all I can say, but we'll see what happens. We'll see how it all works out." So that's what's left of Donald Trump's endorsement of Kevin McCarthy tonight. We'll see what happens. You can be sure that those 20 Republicans who voted against Kevin McCarthy today, who are very friendly with Donald Trump, are reminding Donald Trump of this.
The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. These facts require immediate action by President Trump. Accept his share of responsibility, quell the brewing unrest, and ensure President-elect Biden is able to successfully begin his term.
And not long after that, a panicked Kevin McCarthy thought that that temporary burst of honesty could be cured 2 weeks later in Florida by standing there with Donald Trump and getting his picture taken. This is not Kevin McCarthy's first attempt to win the speakership, as Alex and I were just discussing. The first time was in 2015, but his campaign for speakership disintegrated because of a breathtaking public display of stupidity, which also demonstrated that as of then, the Republican Party still had standards of some sort.
What you're going to see is a conservative speaker that takes a conservative Congress that puts a strategy to fight and win. And let me give you one example. Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why? Because she's untrustable. But no one would have known any of that had happened had we not fought and made that happen. Good.
The problem with that was that Republicans had literally spent years claiming that their attempt to blame a deadly assault on American officials in Benghazi in 2012 on Hillary Clinton was not political at all. That was the Republican claim. The Republican claim was that they were on a pure fact-finding investigation and they were not out to destroy Hillary Clinton politically in the Benghazi investigation. And when Kevin McCarthy stupidly admitted publicly that harming Hillary Clinton was the only point of the Benghazi investigation, Republican members of the House immediately abandoned him as a possible candidate for Speaker on the grounds that he did not meet the Republican standards at that time for public lying. That's what he got wrong. No one in the Republican Party was surprised that Kevin McCarthy made that mistake then, because Kevin McCarthy's reputation at the time was that he simply was not smart enough to be Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is a difficult job, but the good ones, the great ones, make it look easier than it is.
She wants to see real time where we are, and she's always adding up the numbers.
Orange and Belcher, Bright, Chandler, Childers, Costello, we have to try it again. I invited to this other meeting. Davis, 14, 15.
Some people count sheep at night. I count votes.
It's really close. I mean, it really is close.
Members are coming back saying, I can't do it, I can't do it. And finally she just said, give me the names and leave me alone.
Give me the names and leave me alone. Kevin McCarthy cannot do that. Kevin McCarthy cannot do what you just saw Nancy Pelosi do. He cannot pick up the phone and call those 20 Republicans and get 16 of them, the minimum that he needs, to change their votes. Donald Trump cannot get 16 of them to change their votes. Some speakers in the past have not just maintained the loyalty of their party, but they have actually been loved by most of the members of their party in the House of Representatives. Speakers like Nancy Pelosi, speakers like Tip O'Neill. None of the Republican speakers of my lifetime have been loved. For the first 40 years of my lifetime, we did not have a Republican Speaker of the House. Then came Newt Gingrich, who was driven out of the job by Republicans. Then came Dennis Hastert, who went out in scandal and ended up in federal prison. And then came John Boehner, who cried his way out of the job. Then came Paul Ryan, who simply gave up and chose not to run for re-election to his House seat. Not a tear was shed for a single one of those Republican speakers when they left, except John Boehner's tears shed for himself. So it will be exactly the same way for Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy knows tonight that not a single tear will be shed for him in the House among Republicans if he ever makes it to Speaker. He also knows tonight that if he loses his attempt to be Speaker, not a single tear will be shed. And if he does make it to Speaker, Kevin McCarthy knows right now he will be the weakest Speaker of the House we have ever seen.